computer. There we go. And we are live and we are recording. So Arnita, take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to A Language of Healing Live today. Today, we are going to be talking about Chapter 12 and busting up your bias. But before we do that, I'd like to take a minute to introduce to you our facilitator today. And he is the first guy who got to call me Mom. And now he calls me Ma. And that's all cool. His name is Evan Michael Taylor. And Evan is just an incredible human being. You know, I started to think about the irony of having a mom introduce her son in regarding bias. And it's just, you know, it's kind of funny that today, of all days, we're talking about bias, I'm introducing my son. But Evan is a tremendous human being. He's very generous with his time and resources and really cares about people, sometimes a little bit too much. Evan happens to love political science and politics, unlike his mother, but he does hold a bachelor's degree in political science from Southern Methodist University here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He's a very brilliant mind. He also has a couple of master's degrees from Duke University, one in public policy with an emphasis in social policy, which is great, and the other one is a master's of business administration. In addition to that, Evan is a phenomenal teacher, just a phenomenal teacher and instructor, and I know he'll take us the way he does with brilliance today. He was a member of the Teach for America Corps, where he taught high schoolers biology, chemistry, and physics. God bless him. We're going to be easier on him today than that was. Right now, he currently lives in Baltimore, Maryland, where he is a banking executive for M&T Bank, and it's just a thrill to have him today. What I love about having Evan today is he is a voice under 30. And as we go forward in these conversations, we need to have them across generational lines. And so it's good to have a young one leading us today. So Evan, take it away.
Sure, I need to have you introduce me in other meetings. That was, I don't know if I deserve some of that, but I guess that's where that mommy bias kicks in. But couldn't be more excited to spend time with you all. Excited about the topic, excited to dive into this. Just a few housekeeping things. You know, my mom mentioned I used to be a teacher, so I think silence can be powerful. So for my speakers, what I'll do is, you know, I'll point, you know, some of these questions at specific people, and once they have a chance to give their primary response, I'll pause for about 5 to 10 seconds to see if anybody else wants to chime in. That way you can really think about it and you don't have to rush into interrupting each other and all those types of things. You know, based on what I hear, I might also ask some follow-up questions just to make the conversation as organic as it can be. And just a reminder, I'm sure you're aware, that the first 15 minutes or so, I'll direct the questions specifically to the authors. Then we'll open it up to the rest of the crew. So let's dive into this. So I'm actually going to push the first question to my mom. I don't know if I should call you Arnita or Mom. Maybe I'll do it Arnita for someone who joins late and is confused. So Arnita, so you talked about in chapter 12 that, you know, if you don't honestly locate bias within yourself, you might stay lost in a fog. And I thought that was a powerful statement. So, you know, I think some biases are obvious, some might be unconscious or implicit. So can you talk more about the actions someone can take to uncover their biases that might not be as obvious to them?
You know, it's almost like an oxymoron to have unconscious bias, to be able to find something when you don't know it's there. So one of the actions that I would recommend is just going forward, understanding that you have bias. Whether you can identify it or not, just be mindful that you have bias and that shows up in your perspective and how you relate to people. Another thing I would recommend is to just make it a stretch goal for yourself. You know, I'm a leadership development coach and I always give people goals for the year. Certainly identifying your implicit bias would be a stretch goal, but if you dare and if you have enough courage, you can actually ask people close to you where they think you have bias. Because whether we know it or not, we are always messaging and we are always off-putting our biases, always. So sometimes when you invite people into that space, they'll tell you, but don't be retaliatory or stop speaking to them or unfriend them on Facebook or anything like that, because they're not going to be honest with you. But you can ask for help in uncovering them. I think another way to just have action against unconscious bias is to recognize where you fall into a groupthink strategy. Now, groupthink in and of itself is a bias, but if you are really just thinking like the group and have not really taken time to individually assess how you feel about something, that's probably a pretty good place that you have some unconscious bias, and that's always an easy place to go. Go there. You can also take actions to just look at the people you hang out with. Do you have an affinity bias? Is everybody around you like you? So those are just some actions you can take to uncover unconscious bias. But I promise you, if you are bold enough to ask people who live near you or who converse with you on a routine basis, they can give you some feedback. It's what you do with that feedback.
Very good.
It was fantastic, is what it was, Arnita. And I'll tell you, we're watching the word bubble now has a different meaning than it used to because of the pandemic. And so I think about the NBA that has kind of shown us what it's like to live in a larger bubble, but oftentimes these biases exist within our own bubble. And so I just want to say, Arnita, exactly what you said. If you can't see it in yourself when you look in the mirror, ask one of your friends, ask somebody you hang out with. I think that's about as wise as anything I've ever heard.
And what if your friends are wrong?
Well, I don't know what to tell you. Hopefully your friends are honest, right?
Oh, I think friends can be honest, but sometimes when they're being reactive, like in the current climate where we're speaking up on issues I've not spoken up on when I was younger, and I have people from my past who then make accusations back. Well, you're just biased in this way. You're a liberal now. You're a communist. You're a whatever.
Oh my gosh.
And you go, that's not always just because your friends think you're biased, weighted a certain direction doesn't mean they are. So I like the idea of you got to really think it through and listen. And if it's somebody who really loves and cares about you, give that a ton more weight than someone making accusations about you.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's powerful. No, I agree with a lot of what was said. So let's shift to the second question. I'm really curious about this one. One of the things that floated to the top or stood out to me was the comment that our negative experiences and negative exposure confirm our bias, right? So I'm curious. I'm going to push this to you, Wayne. I'm curious. Can you elaborate more on that statement? And if you're willing to add, do you feel that bias only works in the negative direction? Meaning, is it only our negative experiences that are confirmed, or could it potentially be our positive experiences as well?
Yeah, I would, to answer the last part first, yeah, I would think both of our experiences inform us that way. I think why it's worded the way it is, we're talking more about confirmation bias, which I have a bias against drivers of BMW automobiles. Every rude, arrogant driver in Southern California drives a BMW. So if I'm being cut off in traffic, I'm thinking, gosh, those are cotton picking BMW drivers. And I think that way. Now, if I pass a BMW driver who graciously lets me into traffic, I don't think, wow, I could be wrong about BMW drivers. I'm going, that's an exceptional one. That guy shouldn't be driving a BMW. And I think that's how those biases play out in our lives in other ways. We just, if we get the confirmation we want, then we're all good. And if we don't get it, then we'll go, oh, that's an exception. Or the other way we do that is, and I've seen it done with, if you can find a successful Asian businessman or a successful Indian businessman, then that proves there's no bias in America. That's your bias. There's no bias. So if anyone can be successful, everyone can be successful. So those are ways that when we're confirming biases, which I think are pretty negative entities. If I'm biased for someone, I don't call that bias. I call it love. I love them and I care about them and I'm going to help them do whatever. So I do look at bias on the negative side more. And I think one of the greatest dangers we have is that we look for confirmation of our bias. And we can find plenty of that because we're looking for it. And then when we find the exception, we write it off. We don't go, hold it. Maybe I'm wrong. And that's the more important question we need to have with ourselves. When we see something positive from someone we're biased against, it shouldn't just make them an exception. We should really step back and say, my bias is misinforming me and my stereotypes are keeping me from a kind of good that needs to happen in the world.
I'm curious if I can probe on that a bit. I appreciate your response. What happens, if, the bias is as simple as, last time I engaged with a white male, I had a positive experience, so I'm only going to surround myself with white males. Or last time I hired a white male, they perform well. So in essence, it's a positive bias that, as a result of having that bias, it might exclude others that don't have access to that identity.
Yeah, and I would say that's an exclusionary bias. Obviously, if I'm biased for this, but it's what I like and what I want more of, and so I'm leaving people out, that's something people really have to dig into, this day and age especially, and say, am I just finding the people like me that I want to have around me, or making an assumption because I had one good employee, all employees of that ilk are going to be the same way? It's going to be problematic for sure, and needs to be.
So we see it all the time. It's like, it's why more men are in leadership positions. Men are just better leaders than women. That's what some people's bias would tell them. Or taller people are just better at leadership positions. I mean, they're pretty people we just need to hire pretty people. So that's the type of bias that always has to be managed, because it directly relates to how you engage with people in discriminatory practice. Discriminatory practice is more than organizational, it's individual, which is what we try to draw attention to in a language of healing. Start with you. Yeah, start with you. If you can't find it in you, you can't find it in a system.
That's right.
It's impossible.
And just over the weekend, I saw a BMW that took up 3 parking places. So I can confirm everything that you're believing there, Wayne.
See, I'm not surprised, not one bit.
I know.
Oh, I love that. So let's move to a different topic. So I'm going to push this one to you, Bob. You talked about the wisdom of asking questions, and you even talked about a scenario within, I believe, it's called your Common Ground group, where you talked about the dialogue around, the semantics of Black and or versus African American, and which is proper, which is acceptable, et cetera. My question is, how do we continue to have really productive conversations across lines of difference that don't disproportionately place an emotional, spiritual, or even intellectual burden on those with marginalized identities? And the reason I ask it is, I think in this environment that we're in, so many marginalized people are being asked to tell their story, which is a beautiful thing, right? Those stories need to be told. I'm wondering if you have any comments around how do we guard against them being the emotional vomiters, if you will, and them having to bring so much more to the table. I'm curious if you have responses to that.
Yeah, thanks for leaving that question for me, by the way, Evan. I appreciate it.
I'm grateful too. I'm grateful too.
Yeah, Wayne is also grateful. I think EQ comes into play, the ability to emotionally read where you are and to be aware and be cognizant of your surroundings. At the same time, I have this thing that I do. I'm not afraid to ask questions, and I think fear keeps us from pressing in. Like during that Common Ground meeting, the young man who was leading that group, when he asked it, at first I thought, oh my gosh, what in the world are you doing? Because half of the room was African American, but it diffused so much right out of the gate. I can remember years ago, I was doing a video show for our local newspaper, and one of the people I interviewed was a second-generation Chinese American pastor, and I asked him, because I'm just curious, what was it like growing up in Bakersfield, California, as a Chinese American? Because it's different here than it is in other places around the world. It just is. And he stopped for a minute, and I could see the wheel spinning, and he finally said, that's a fair question. But we have to not be afraid to engage one another. Fear keeps us from just knowing one another. Like it would have been real easy for my friend, the young man who was leading that common ground group, to just not even go there. And it took an awful lot of courage for him to ask that question and to risk what came next, because you don't know what comes next when you ask those kinds of questions. But I think as a balance to that, we've got to have the ability to emotionally read who it is we're asking and what it is we're asking, and then use wisdom. Somebody else ought to jump in on that.
I would even say likewise that on the flip side, the person that's being asked the question has got to have the emotional intelligence to know, are they asking this in sincerity? Do they really want to know
Right.
what, is on my mind? Or is this just a formality question, a general, let's just have some fluff conversation question? Because there's times where people will ask me, in this climate, how are you doing? And it's like, do you really want to know how I'm doing? Because there's a whole lot we can unpack, and I don't know if you're ready.
Love that, Raylene. I read an article a while back that talked about comforting people who've got a loved one that's terminally, in the hospital dying, perhaps, whatever. And it said, always make sure that comfort flows to the person in need, not getting them to comfort you. And a lot of people do that. And I think to your question, Evan, I think a lot of people right now are kind of going to African Americans to be comforted themselves, not to genuinely hear their story and help them. And I think that's where the drain comes in. And if you have the sense, and I think people often do, when the person coming to you, are they really looking to help you? Or are they looking to be comforted themselves? And if it's going that way, I'd get out of the conversation fairly quickly, because it's not going to inure to your benefit. But where people are genuinely, and you have the emotional energy to take them there with your story, do it. But I think there's a lot of people of my ilk these days that want to be comforted. Oh, I'm not a racist and I've done right things. And that's putting all that care back on them. And that's not what's needed right now. And so I think people need to opt out of that environment.
Mm-hmm. I would just jump in and say, just to what you were saying, Wayne, that at this time, I'm not sure that I have the emotional capacity to help people who want me to confirm that they are or are not racist. Yep. I don't feel like I have the capacity to help you identify that you are not a racist, and not saying you, but I mean for people who ask those questions, because often, it sometimes feels to me like the question, like, am I fat? Like, when you're overweight, or if you have done some things that have not been right. And I think that we all have, as you said before, we all have some biases. There are biases that we all have. And when people say, I don't have a bias and I treat everybody the same, that's a lie. You have an affinity for one thing or another. And I think that part of what emotionally drains me, especially during this time, is that the people who try so hard to make that a point, because you don't have to tell me, I can see from who you are and how you act, how you feel and what you do about certain situations. And if your conversation or question is genuine, I can also feel that as well.
Yeah, really good.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I think we can open it up now to other people that want to chime in. I'm gonna ask a question. I'm gonna direct it towards Wayne, but I want all the participants at this point. I think we can open it up to everybody. So the chapter 12 mentions finding broad-based common ground, and I thought that was really well phrased. My question is, what happens if the journey to finding that common ground stalls? So Wayne, if you could kick us off there, then anybody else, please chime in.
The problem is, if it stalls, the only other option is war at whatever level you're willing to fight it. Doesn't necessarily mean guns and military. It may just mean anger and angst and hitting the streets, which sometimes you have to do to get attention. It's sometimes the protest or Gandhi's hunger strikes, whatever, it calls attention to a problem. calls attention to the fact that people are not being listened to. We don't even have right now, I don't think, in the US, a common ground environment in which to manage the debate right now, particularly on racial terms. So you've got people stacked on one side, and when you talk about people who already think they don't have any biases, I think the woke crowd is as much in that camp as anybody. They got to prove they don't have it, and they're better than everybody else, and people on the right do the same thing because they've got their Bibles, and their Bible told them certain things, and so they know they're right. They don't have to think twice about anything. Unfortunately, our democratic process right now doesn't tend towards the common ground. It doesn't tend towards, I'm going to care about you, you're going to care about me, and we're going to be fair to our differences. The system we have now is, how can we polarize these people to get more votes than the other side can get? And both parties are involved in it. Our democracy is involved in it. I'm a common ground guy. You give me 30 people in a room, and if it's a broad enough diversity and you've got that part of it right, I think people will sit and listen to each other. I think they'll be moved by each other's stories. I think they'll find solutions that will be of great benefit to other people. But in the absence of that, we're seeing it right now. We're seeing the anger and animosity and the frustration that nothing I do seems to matter, because we're not yet getting to the wheels of power. We're just the angst of a culture. And people are cementing their positions even harder. And I'm really concerned that we are headed toward, guns on the street, because there are already groups carrying guns into the street that's going to defend their point of view. And then other people bring guns into the street to defend theirs. And we're in a very hostile climate, and it makes my heart hurt, because this is a great time for a better conversation. We've got things in the light that haven't been in the light for enough people. And there are people who for the first time are hearing it and seeing it, who need to hear and see it, who've all along thought, oh, the country's, everybody's fair, it's equal opportunity for all. They believe the rhetoric. Now they're becoming aware that that's not true for everybody. And someone needs to step up, some statesperson, somebody, and provide the environment for a better conversation and recommended solutions, because our politicians are not going to do it. The ones we have now certainly are not.
Others, if you want to chime in.
I think you're right, Wayne. When we look around at the leaders that we have now, a friend of mine told me recently, he said, a one-party system is dangerous, but a two-party system where both parties represent the extremes is even more dangerous. And that's where we are right now. We do have two parties. They're working, but they're not working the way they were intended. And so here we are at loggerheads over every issue imaginable, whether it's stimulus, whether it's jobs, whether it's race, whether it's abortion, whether, pick one. There are people vehemently on each side, and they are as far to the extreme as they can be. And it just didn't used to be that way.
Yeah.
I don't know if it used to be
ahead.
that way. Oh, I'm sorry, Pat. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
It used to be that way, or if we didn't have access to it, if we didn't have the ability to see all of the bias, if we didn't have the ability to see the racism in real time. Right. I think it's always been that way. And maybe I'm, a cynic or something. I certainly, did not live through the civil rights era in that time. I was just born then, but I think it's always been that way. And I think that now, because we have this, super access, that we see it. They certainly didn't just start killing people in the streets. It's been happening, but we just couldn't see it. And so now it seems much more egregious, because we see the visuals, we see killings happen in real time. We hear the stories of people being denied, promotions or other things that we didn't really know about before, because we had, I guess if you could call it a luxury of living in our bubble and not a long time for California when it happens. So it does seem a lot more out there, but I think it's always been there.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think you're right.
No, what I was going to say, very similar to what Sonia just said, when you don't deal with the bias, I think you get what we have now, which is this stalemate, or the status quo. What's happening today is not new. You know, we live in an electronic era, so it's kind of out there for everyone to see. But every single decade, we have been here. Every single one. You can go back through history, read past current events, and all that's changed are the names. Same events. There's some sort of injustice. There's cries for justice. It's either poo-pooed, minimized, or we're thrown crumbs. Not real systemic change. And then we go back into this lull, and then, you know, time passes, and then there's another event, and we just keep repeating. And I think that's a result of not dealing with bias, with systemic issues. You just fall into the status quo, and, you know, we go along living our lives, living this masquerade, and then it bubbles up again. It's dealt with in the same way, and then we go back into a lull, and it's a vicious cycle.
So true. So true.
You know, and actually related to that, that actually sets up the next question quite nicely. You know, because bias has become a focal point of conversation, very public conversation, I'm curious, you know, is there a point where someone's refusal to address their bias disqualifies them from being effective as a leader and or person of influence? So, Arnita, I'm going to push that to you first, and then I'm curious for other people to chime in as they see fit.
Well, of course, to answer your question, yes. There is a point where a leader's bias absolutely sabotages her organization, her team, her nation, her state, her city. And the reason why that is always going to happen is because bias is probably the number one factor that comes into play with decision making, period, across the big umbrella. Bias is involved in every decision you make, particularly that a leader makes. And so if your bias is very polarized, you're going to make decisions along one side of your team, your country, your city, your house, whatever, you know, context you want to put it in. It just affects decision making. Actually, for a leader, you really see every team through bias until you learn how to manage that. Now, when I was in graduate school, I had to take implicit association tests out of Harvard that let me know everywhere I had a bias, so that if I was leading those people, I would know I'm going to have accountability with this group of people. I recommend everybody who wants to lead, but particularly to do that, but you know, you could do it even for your personal gratification and learning. Bias will always affect how a leader recruits, how a leader hires, the fit and DNA. Most leaders even give evaluations based on how good the leader is versus how good the person is. So if you're really a biased person, you never get innovation and creativity because you can't hire it, because you can't see it, because you don't think it's important. And so you end up sabotaging potential. Absolutely. There is a time when a leader can absolutely create a train wreck when they cannot manage their bias, nor can they take feedback on their bias. That's why I said in the very first question, if you can ask somebody and you can handle that level of feedback, that's always good. But if you cannot handle it, I would imagine that a lot of leaders just don't have the capacity for that type of information intake to come in, which makes them sabotage their teams. And what happens is high performers and real serious people leave your teams. They say, I'm out, uncle, like I'm not doing this anymore. So of course there's a time where absolutely a leader the bias can sabotage to a fault. Mm-hmm.
I think we're so polarized now that I think even if someone were honest about their bias, there would be people within the camp that just couldn't get with that. How can you admit that you're biased this way and make this decision? You know, because we're very much about our camps. If you believe this, then you must follow this way. And don't tell me you're biased, but you're going to vote that way. I don't think country is ready for that, by and large. And there was someone a while back, I don't know if it was Governor Kasich or it could have been Biden, I don't know. It's been quite some time ago, but I know that they held a personal view, but they politically were going to go in a different direction, opposite of that bias. But that doesn't win a lot of votes. That is a very hard sell because people feel like you need to stay in our camp. Don't tell me you're biased and you're going to, be for this issue. It's tough.
Yeah, it is. Very tough.
I think it requires you to be able to put yourself in the other person's shoes and understand where they are, even if you believe something different. And I think that is part of what is lacking in a lot of what we're doing now, because some of our leaders have lost the ability to put themselves either back in those shoes that they used to be in, or to see what's really affecting their constituents and in their communities. One, I'll give an example. When the Affordable Care Act came and people had lots of issues about that, I didn't really have an issue with that. I have very good health insurance, but I could think about people who did not. And thinking of any way I could help people who did not have health insurance to be able to get health insurance. And I could be for that, even if it meant me paying a little more money, because I knew that, or I remember a time when my mother, there was a struggle. I'm a type 1 diabetic. So I remember a time when there was a struggle for her when I was a child to pay for that very expensive medication. So although I don't have that issue now, I could put myself in the position of those parents who need medication for their kids, or people who have issues. And if we don't have that ability, that empathy, I think that is part of what leaves us hanging in the wind on making decisions.
Good.
Well, I think related to that, I think, your response has made a lot of sense. My mind immediately goes to, okay, well, if there should be perhaps some consequences for leaders who, either refuse to address their bias or don't address it enough, my mind immediately goes to accountability, right? And one of the themes that stood out in chapter 12 to me is, I'm paraphrasing a bit, but it talked about, it's important for people to have the freedom to grow. And I took it a step further to say, even if those people have done or said things in the past they shouldn't have. So I'm curious, how should people be held accountable for the things that they say or do in the past, specifically for the purposes of this conversation as it relates to bias, right? How do we hold them accountable? It's the mixture, it's the balance of grace, but also you said some stuff, you shouldn't have said that stuff, and are you held accountable for that? So I'm going to push it to Bob first, and then we'll open it up to everyone.
Well, I appreciate that question, and I'm getting all the long questions, Evan. Thank you so much.
Just warming up, Bob.
I so appreciate that.
Warming up.
He's warming up. Yeah, we've all done and said things that we regret, that hopefully, if life is doing its job and we're doing our jobs in this life, we're not stagnating and we're moving forward and we're learning as we go. Yeah, I mean, though I've said things, my goodness, I've said things that I could be called on the carpet for. And I am grateful that doesn't happen very often, but I'll tell you what, a week and a half ago, it did happen where someone got to me. I was on a media show with a local personality here in my city, and an African-American, and we talked about anti-racism a bit with another guy, another white guy that was a principal in a law firm. So we talked through, and this man who was leading the discussion, I hired him for his first job 30 years ago. He came in where I was working in a lumber yard. I liked him, and I hired him on the spot. And he brought that up and said how that kind of changed his life, because he's a bit of a prodigy. I mean, he's super smart, and it was really easy to see that. But I remember what I did a day or two after that when he came in. He was a budding hip hop artist who was a rapper. And so I remember saying, hey, so you're a rapper? Yeah, I do some rapping. I said, why don't you rap for us right now? And bang, he spit out a rhyme that was fantastic, but it was a little bit racist of me, maybe not a little bit, to ask him to do that in front of some other people, just on the spot. And someone who saw the broadcast, who worked with me at the time, sent me an email saying, well, aren't you the hypocrite? Acting like you're anti-racist when we all remember that you had him basically dance around and do a rap. So what do you have to say for yourself? Here's what I have to say for myself. It was wrong. I was wrong. And I'm not the same person today that I was. I'm just not. Nowhere near. I mean, and that pales in comparison to the things I did as a young man, because I was raised in a home filled with white supremacy. So it pales in comparison. And if anyone were to come and hold my feet to the fire over the things I've said and done in my life would be over as I know it, at least publicly. So I believe in grace. I believe in growth. I believe in forward movement. Unfortunately, so many people my age choose stagnation over forward movement. Instead of generating and going forward, they choose to say, I know exactly what I believe. These are the ones, by the way, who are saying all lives matter that look like me, that people like me. And so those I can't speak to, but I can speak to people like me who choose to move forward. We have to have grace.
I certainly agree that we have to be in a space to, present grace to individuals that we know have shown their bias or shown their racism and things of that nature. But I also feel like that there's always has to be some accountability, some actions, right, with the words. And so for me, it's holding someone accountable to these things is really watching them and seeing if they're willing to divest from their racism or divest from their bias, not just from their words, but how they move going forward. And not being so quick to, of course, there's always, you give grace by allowing them to be able to operate as an ally or in your space. But still, I have to say that colloquialism, with the side eye, though, you still gonna get the side eye for a little bit because I have to be able to see that you are really intentionally divesting from what you say that you're working towards.
Maybe that's my problem. I give too many side eyes. Perpetually stay in a side eye. I was going to chime in on that. What's the balance there as it relates to accountability when people show or say their biases?
For me, I'm gonna come hard. Grace is grace. Grace is great. We all need to have it. But when you are in a leadership position, there comes a lot of opportunity and a lot of responsibility. And you need to be mindful of that when you go off willy-nilly and want to say crazy stuff. You are absolutely setting yourself up to be held accountable to it. My issue is what you do when I bring it to your attention. Are you too fragile to hear it and you fall apart and you just make it about me? What do you do with that feedback? Leaders have to be in a position. If you are going to lead at any level, you have to be in a position to be held accountable at all times. And it's not going to feel good. It's not going to be comforting. It's not going to be kumbaya. It's not going to be warm and fuzzy. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to be there for you to grow and learn how to relate to people better, because that's what leadership is. It's about a relationship. And I'm taking it probably higher than it needs to be taken, but think about that in just a one-on-one relationship. You cannot come to me with, it's an opportunity to be in relationship with people. So you have to be responsible for how you behave in that relationship. Does your bias inform that? Yes, it does, because it informs every decision. So perhaps when you deal with me, you have to challenge your own bias, because if you don't, I'm going to let you know. You know, it's just a matter of how much truth you want. I shoot so much truth. I have to ask people, what percentage of 100 do you want today? You know, I try to stay at about 27%, so I just don't blow people out of the water. But yeah, accountability, grace, responsibility, that all goes together. Grace to me is the manner in which you approach someone, but it's not approaching them. So perhaps I need to clarify that. Do I need to say amen?
27%. 27%. All right.
Her 27% is like most people's 99.
Might go with
That is
6.
so true, Bob.
Trust
You
me.
said
That
it,
is
not
a
me.
true statement.
Yeah, 6% is a better choice, probably.
Okay, 6. Then I'll say 6 for y'all. Just out of relationship, I'm gonna say 6. Yeah, 6.
So a lot of the conversation so far, and even in chapter 12, was around kind of the personal journey of uncovering, dealing with, addressing, you know, the biases that we all have. I'm curious if we can zoom out in how we contextualize it. You know, so much, let's say, post George Floyd, post Breonna Taylor, so much has happened, right? And we've addressed some of it here. I'm curious, you know, how do we shift the conversation around bias from just a personal conversation, you know, Evan needs to deal with his bias so it doesn't cause problems, to more of this systemic conversation that everybody wants to use that word now, right? So it's in this new environment where, you know, if one were to argue that biases are sitting in our systems, our systemic way of operating, how do we shift the conversation from personal reflection to systemic change? And I'm going to push this one first to Wayne, and then we can open it up.
To Bob. That's what I said.
I'll push it to Wayne.
Bob has one coming next. Just wait.
This one's tough, because even the word systemic racism means so many different things to different people. Man, I was in Kenya 10 years ago or so, and I'm out on the frontier of Kenya. I'm out where there's not really official stores, there's just mats on the ground, people selling stuff. And it was really a frontier, kind of no infrastructure, nothing. And I think that's where we are in this discussion about systemic racism in America. We're on the frontier. And we're not even using the same words among different groups of people to mean the same thing. And that complicates our need to, like you say, take it from individual into a good look at our institutions and what they do to downplay certain people and unnecessarily elevate others or unfairly elevate others. But my concern, given the discussion we just had about mistakes and how do we hold people accountable? Well, if you're a police officer that's killed somebody who's unarmed and unnecessarily, well, that accountability is very, very different from somebody that made a joke that, you know, didn't go over real well or was part of something in their past. And I think we need to have that conversation to figure out how we sort out those kinds of things and really allow people to grow. I know the Me Too movement for me, I made a lot of jokes as a kid growing up to the detriment of women, whether it's on a golf course or, you know, I wasn't in the locker room, you know, that kind of talk that caught Donald Trump with a few years back. But I was in the conversations that just, you know, you swing like a girl, you know, you just have those conversations, you run like a girl. That whole process changed me, just watching sisters I loved and now seeing the sting in those words, which I didn't see at the time, oblivious to it for sure. But do we want an environment in which people can't grow, in which people can't admit their racism without being hauled to the ground, hauled to their knees, forced to repent? And we're, like I said, we're in the frontier time of this, where there's not really clearly how we're going to negotiate this. And are we going to let people own up to past mistakes and see hope for change? Or do we want people punished for every stupid thing they've ever said or done? And that, I don't know that we have the weight right now to make this move from personal And our book certainly didn't make it. We didn't go to systemic racism, and but we're about to. There's an organization that's asked the three of us to come and help them build an anti-racist culture, and we're not going, okay, this is going to be as much a learning experience for me as anything else.
Right.
We got to
I'm
give
good.
people. Yeah, we got to give people the opportunity to grow. We've got to give people the opportunity to change. We got to give people the opportunity to be able to say, I made this mistake. And if your mistake cost other people, part of admitting a mistake is, what can I do to make that up to you? I mean, that's part of Sarah and I, my wife, and our apologies. Our apologies are, oh, I'm really sorry I did that. It's, I'm sorry. How can I make it up to you? That comes next. How can I make it up to you? Our culture's got a lot of work to do. How do we make it up to people? 1.2 million Black Americans come back from World War II and are not given access to GI Bill. That changed the trajectory of many white families. It wasn't given. So I'm not even back to reparations. Let's just deal with, we didn't give the same opportunity for Black families to get a hold on the first rungs of the ladder in society. And generations now have been suffered from that. So the challenges of racism is, how are we going to have systemic racism? How are we going to have that talk? And how are we going to find solutions? And that's probably the best accountability in the world, is to find a better solution for the things that you've been engaged with in the past that have been hurtful. I just don't see it right now, but cancel culture makes it almost impossible for people of my ilk to admit past problems. You just don't make it, because you're going to be marginalized by the group you'd like to have some equitability with, and you're going to be marginalized by your own group, who's now you're one of them, so you end up in no man's land. And I hope we can have a better discussion, Evan, quite honestly. I think it's a common ground environment is. I think it's what our book pushes towards. How can we have mistakes, own them, have people hold me accountable to change? I love what you said. Now, if you're serious about that, you'll live differently. And I love that kind of accountability. Right now, we don't have it. And people are afraid to own up.
I'm going to gently, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Wayne. I'm going to gently push you on that.
Go ahead.
I think, the systemic piece is lofty. I get it, right? And maybe that's not, the aim of what you wrote. But what about the individualized part of the system, the part of the system we own as individuals? Where does that play in? What's our responsibility there? And how do we shift the conversations to recognizing I benefit from a system? I like this system. I live in this system. I'm allowed to exist because of this system. How do we talk about bias and change and growth in that context? And this is for anyone.
As you're asking this question, it reminds me of kind of my pastor. He has a worldview called the Kingdom Agenda worldview. And he addresses this by way of talking about addressing things from 4 different standpoints, right? Your personal, your family, your church, and the government. And so when I'm thinking about this question, I'm thinking about how are we addressing racism and bias in our lives, right? Individually, I think right now we're in a place where we're looking at it in our individuals, we're confronting racism and bias, right? We're confronting them in our families now. We're having these hard conversations with our families. I've talked to a lot of my white friends that have said, I've talked to my parents about the way that I've grown up and the things that have been said to me. And we're confronting these and having these real conversations. And so I think we're now getting to this place and space where within the church and within the government and these institutions in which we live in and we operate in, we've got to be intentional in making that shift. How am I changing me? I've now looked at the man in the mirror and I see what I'm doing. I'm now looking at my family and I see what we're doing. But how can we make that shift to our church and our government? And in these institutions in which we operate in. And I think it's now that we've been self-introspective and we've started to become self-actualized, it's how do I use this information in my spheres of influence? We're all sitting on boards and playing at the golf course and having these conversations in places and spaces, and we have to be willing to confront them with our spheres of influence in hopes that they can bleed into the systems in which we have influence in. And I think the place that we're probably not at right now, but we need to get at is no longer being afraid to have those conversations. Right. We can closetly say, these things aren't right. And systemically, we have some issues here, but we're afraid to confront it with the people that maybe don't believe the same things we believe, but we sit across the boardrooms from them and allow the decisions to be made that continue to perpetuate this racism and systemic things that are happening. And so it's just now being a matter of getting some gumption to be able to say, I want to have a voice in this, because that's how I can play and use my influence.
100% right. 100% right. We have to find a new boldness. I mean, with tact, and look at those who I have influence over. I have influence in their lives. Like, I have the ability to speak in, and so I do this podcast called "A Christian and a Muslim Walk into a Studio," and when I first started doing that podcast, I began to receive legitimate hate mail from my tribe. Legitimate hate mail. What fellowship has light to do? What fellowship has light with darkness? How dare you give this man who wants to kill all of us a platform? Those types of things. And I began to push back at that point. I think prior to that, I don't think I was really good at it. But I think that was almost my training ground for today, because today I don't turn the other cheek, so to speak. I mean, I do, but when somebody sends me something that has racist undertones, I gently contact them and say, you realize how this can be seen, right? And I don't know you that way. Can you just step away from those type of talking points and be better? And I've seen some success with some friends where I take them and personally just gently say, this isn't who you are. And we can't stay here anymore as people that look like me. We can't stay here anymore. Those days are in the past.
Well, personally, I think it's a leadership constraint, because if Arnita is the top of a system that's not equitable, I'm going to make it equitable, or I'm going to get everybody out of it that won't let me, because I can be on my own team. So sometimes it represents a leadership capacity. One of the arguments that I see people have is a system is racist if there's one racist person in it. That may be true, but I'm talking about with systemic racism when the entire system is oppressive to a group of people.
Right.
So that's what I'm talking about. When the entire system, the way the system operates, is oppressive and exclusionary to one group of people. Now, that's systemic racism. It's everywhere. The reason I think in a language of healing, the racism piece has taken off so much is because, in general, in the United States of America, racism undergirds every system and institution. And we are just now getting kicked in the face with that. So people are going, oh my gosh, we can talk about this? I was told to never talk about this. There's always negative bias around talking about race. But that's why you see so much of the language, the conversations coming now, is because that really is the place we're most polarized, because it's systemic in the systems and the foundations of America.
I do agree. I think that, the racism is deep rooted, and because it has not been addressed in the systems of America, it has continued. And again, it's more prevalent now because we can see it and we can call it something now that we weren't able to in years past. To go back to the cancel culture of canceling, companies and people who say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing. And sometimes I wonder, did they say the wrong thing, or they just got caught on the hot mic saying what they said? Were they actually sorry? So to talk about you, Bob, when you asked the gentleman to rap, it probably didn't occur to you that that's like asking him to perform a minstrel show. That probably did not occur to you.
No, it didn't.
Also, when you get caught on the hot mic saying what you believe for Black people, or what you don't think Black people can do or should do, that's not by accident. And when you are the head of the company, as Arnita said, then that just trickles down. I mean, we can see it when it's the head of the country, that whole mannerism, that attitude has trickled down to bring out the other people who also believe that. But because no one, you know, at the top level was verbalizing it in that way, it was kept inside. But now that it's verbalized, it seems to be okay to say. So, you know, when I think about canceling a company or I'm not spending my money there, my money is my power. But I also feel like, you know, I want to see changed behavior. And that I don't want you to throw money at the problem, you know. So when you say, you know, oh, we got caught, or we stand Black Lives Matter and we're going to donate, you know, $100 million to whatever. Well, you've just given some money. You haven't, what does your boardroom look like? You know, what does your management team look like? What does your staff look like? Because that's how you're going to change the culture of your company. Not when you say, you know, for instance, I'm going to give $100 million to do diversity programs. Well, and excuse me, but that's just teaching white folk how to not show their racism, in my opinion. But what are you doing at the very top? Not just giving the money to say, hey, go start a diversity program, but we're going to show that we're going to be diverse from the very top. And we're going to examine our company and we're going to examine our business and how we do business. And we're going to do some things differently. I think that when you don't do that, and if I don't see that being done, I'm honestly not interested in continuing to have the conversation. I'm just interested in zipping up my purse. So I don't have to buy Goya beans. I don't. Or I don't have to buy whatever kind of other, you know, product that you sell. And my, you know, little $5 might not make a big difference, but, you know, I feel like I can do at least that much. You either are in or you're out. And I think that that's where the cancel culture for the younger people has become, where they don't feel like they want to give a chance. But I do think that we should give a chance for you to show a changed behavior.
You know, it's a lot of work taking something from being a program to culture.
Right.
When we start addressing bias and talking about bias, which is why I love organizational development, is it takes a lot to move a culture a little bit, a lot. So to be encouraged, the conversations make a difference. They move the needle. They do move the needle. But to get transformative change, you're going to have some pretty stout leadership in there somewhere pushing it down. And I don't care what level of organization it is. That's going to always be true. It can be your family. You know, if dad is racist, mom is racist, kids going to be racist. When you stop that at the top levels, you shut it down. Really, I think we have a leadership crisis, period, in America. You know what? I was just thinking, I don't sit on anybody's boards. I don't know if anybody's going to be watching this, but y'all really need me. But at any rate, and I digress.
I don't sit on one either, but yeah, they need us.
Sit on boards. So at any rate, I do think
you were asked once, Arnita, and you turned them down, right?
Well, yeah, I turned them down because they were too biased on one side. So, you know, we had that talk.
I know.
So I do think it's a leadership constraint. I really do. And I'm not using personal leadership either. Again, I'm talking about leadership in general. You get what you allow, always. That's always. Don't care what context you're in. So culture versus program is going to be a big deal with systems and institutions. And I can't wait to go into the institution that has invited us. It's going to be fun.
Well, I think I'll let you have the last word, Arnita, and then it's been an honor, you know, talking with you all today. I learned a lot, and I appreciate just the intentionality around having these conversations, because I think they're going to be part of moving the needle. And I don't think any of us have all the right answers, but if we continue to surround ourselves with people that challenge us, I think we're in a good space. So thank you all for your time, and I hope that you and your family stay safe.
Thank you, Evan.
Thank you,
Great
Evan.
job. Yeah, it's great.
You're a rock
You
star.
guys.
Great job,
Thanks everybody
Evan.
for being on the
Thank
call.
you. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Bye
Thanks
now.
for having me.
Take care.
Thanks for
Bye.
being here. Bye now.